I'm going to start with a couple of reflections, one small and one big. My small one, if you like, was about today. I just wanted to say that coming and speaking at STM, as we all kind of come back to getting together internationally after the pandemic, has been an absolute highlight of my year, in fact, of recent years. And I just think the team behind STM is fabulous to work with. Jo is an absolute dream. She puts everything in one place. I can find it on the move. She's so intuitive in knowing what an outside speaker being pulled in all directions needs. And so, yes, yes, and yes again, if you ever want to have me come and speak again. But thank you to all of you. Beautiful. And perhaps also it's interesting catching up with people that I've seen around, because I've been in my job for quite some time, and thinking about the fact that I got to know some of you back when, sort of 15 years ago, when publishing was making that transition straight from the 19th to the 21st century. And what is so lovely to see is that some of you were the kind of secret revolutionaries in your organisations at that time, and that now you are leading front and centre with some of the really enlightened kind of social citizen ideas of what a company is, and that again is really nice to see. I've really enjoyed working with many of you. So despite the journey that the wider companies were taking, I think many of you could see the need to take an active role in many aspects of our information landscape. So yeah, wonderful to see all that. Okay, for those of you who don't know Sense About Science, we're a non-profit, a charity based in the UK and working very often internationally. We promote the public interest in sound science and evidence. And what that actually means is we think about things in terms of what stops open critical use of evidence in public life. So this is our kind of working model for thinking about what we're going to do. And that boils down largely to three things: secrecy, intimidation, and ignorance, or knowledge if you prefer that term, because ignorance sounds very rude. And what we really mean by that is just not knowing the right questions to ask. And it's something that afflicts our media, our politicians, ourselves, and anyone working trying to fathom out another area that they don't have expertise in. So these are things which mean we end up with the evidence missing from public life when we have secrecy, when we have decisions being made and the evidence not shared, but that sits behind them. We have intimidation, which I'm sure many of you worry about in different ways. We end up with researchers missing, either because they find the public space too daunting, or in some cases we have researchers around the world who are actively chased out of the public domain, and that's a problem of its own. But largely we have questions of ignorance where we are not equipped. Things move fast in our world and we don't have the questions to ask how reliable is the basis on which we're taking decisions. What kind of questions do we need for a world that seems dominated by things like AI and new forms of energy and problems that sound too big and complex to solve with any one bit of expertise? So how do we do this? We do three things. We work with the public, and by the public I include also journalists and politicians, to ask good questions. We equip them with good questions. This is our Ask for Evidence campaign, which helps people to formulate questions about anything that is a decision in public life, and it's quite popular. We also we equip them with questions about the nature of the knowledge that they're being given. So how reliable is this? Can I depend on it? Is it something that other scientists have looked at? And to sort of try and put something in a context, because from a public point of view, we work with community groups in every sort of walk of life, they're so often treated to a bit of research information, completely free-floating and unconnected to any measure of reliability or where does this come from. So we equip people. This is our peer review guide, which we published with some very forward-thinking people in publishing 15 years ago, and it just went a storm, actually. It went, millions and millions of copies got circulated, it got translated into 9 different languages, it became the basis of the BBC's and many other media's outlets' code of conduct, asking, is it peer-reviewed, and if it is, we have to make a link to the original study that this claim came from, which they didn't used to do before a decade ago. It's used in school curriculum and many other places now, so it's been a huge success. Also moving quickly to look at those areas that are emerging where people need to ask good questions, and obviously AI and data science has been a big one. And this is Data Science Effort, the first guide ever in the world for society, which we published in 2019. And that's quite remarkable, isn't it, when you think about how many governments around the world had announced a multi-billion-dollar strategy for data science, and not one person had thought, what are the key questions that we need to ask? What are the questions we need to be asking in our parliaments? What do our journalists need to be asking at press conferences? What do our commissioners and procurement need to be asking? And I'd still say to this day, we're a long way behind that curve in thinking about the equipment, the social equipment that people need. Sense About Science is contacted so often by people who are just trying to fathom the basis on which decisions are being made. And the people who are making those decisions are unable to explain them either. And so we're very much at risk of doing in data science what we had in medicine back in the 60s, which was that a handful of people were too smart to explain it to the rest of us, and we all felt too dumb to ask. And we've taken 50 years or so of the informed patient movement to get to a point where we can actually ask sensible questions about treatment. And here we are back again with data science, where you have politicians announcing a multi-billion euro strategy, but being too scared already to ask, by the way, what's big data? And they'd all secretly like to ask. So, so we kind of recognise this and are now in the business of trying to encourage people into some fairly rapid remedial action. Simple questions like, where does it come from, what's being assumed, and can it bear the weight being put on it? So we work with the public to ask those kind of questions and to give them those questions, but we also work with researchers to help to answer those questions and anticipate them, and to answer them in ordinary human language. And this is our Risk Know-How project, which is a huge collaboration around the world, looking at trying to put together questions or helping people to put risk information on major areas such as climate changes, infrastructure damage, and risk to life and limb in all sorts of areas, food safety, how to actually communicate within their communities about those risks. And these are people who are, we would call, practitioners. Now, they're not practitioners in the sense that they've trained for something. Often, they're people who find themselves, say, in a town hall type situation, in the middle of a debate about whether or not an incinerator is going to be a dangerous addition to the community, or whether there's high levels of pollution in the river, and trying to find some way of navigating that debate. But they might be people such as Bernard Akebe, who is a journalist, vernacular journalist on radio, helping farmers to understand what the heck does average rainfall mean. Does it mean average across these farms? Does it mean average over the years? Does it mean average for this year? You know, really trying to help people navigate. So you have, on the one hand, a very frustrated bunch of people at the UN making public statements complaining that people aren't taking action fast enough. And then you have farmers going, I have no idea what that information means. I don't even know what kind of an average you're giving me, and I've got to make an actual practical decision about sowing flood-resistant crops and losing 30% of my yield. So this is a project really that highlights the gap between the real questions as they present themselves in society and the kind of informational services that people are currently exposed to. And it's a set of principles as well about how we work as a community to empower ourselves. And researchers, I'm very pleased to say, around the world have been absolutely fabulous in this. In fact, the American Statistical Association, I don't think we have anyone from there here. I wish we did, because they've absolutely led the way in thinking about ways in which they can help communities, sit with communities to ask and answer these questions, which is a different model. If you think about it, so often the way that we see the world of science or research presented is that you have the public space, you have decision makers and politicians, and there's the public pulling one way, with their kind of crazy demands. And then you have the researchers on the other trying to whisper in the ear of decision makers saying, be sensible, look at the evidence. In fact, this is a very different model, which is researchers and the public together working on how to formulate really good questions to put to information providers and policymakers. So that's risk know-how. And then finally, the third prong of what we do is we work with both the public and researchers to ensure and safeguard that public space for us to have discussions openly and honestly about research and research findings. This is All Trials, which Rachel mentioned, which was a global campaign that involved tens of thousands of people, doctors, patients, just consumers, getting behind a campaign that transformed the behaviour of drug companies. The FDA has changed the way that its rules, European Medicines Agency, and all of the international trials registries. So it was an incredibly powerful campaign to get all clinical trials results published, not just the half that people are interested in telling you about. And we have seen a huge change. For example, pharma companies alone in Europe, or certainly in the UK and most of Europe, went from 47% reporting on trials on the medicines today to 97% in the space of a few years. So once the tide turned, it really turned. And that was with the motor of public support behind it. This is Models for Decision Making, Models for Policy Decision Making, which was a collaboration we did with the European Commission, and it was based on that what I just showed you in relation to the questions we need to ask. And so sometimes what we have to do to sort of push for better evidence in public life is to make people be frank about the fact that they don't know what they're handling. And this has been an incredibly useful tool to just get big decision makers on European policy to say quite honestly that they don't really know what the models are based on that they're using, and to have a full and frank discussion. So this was another piece of work we did in this space. And then I just sort of want to mention also the intimidation piece around what we do with the Maddox Prize, which we award with Springer Nature each year, which is to award people who have stood up for science in the face of intimidation. And around the world, I just can't begin to describe the kinds of ways in which researchers have shown great bravery in the face of some fairly intimidating public spaces. And I do urge you to look at who's won the Maddox Prize for a bit of, if you ever need a bit of inspiration about the bravery that researchers can find within themselves when they know that they need to help the public through a difficult debate. The sorts of people that we've had, for example, 2 years ago, Eukaria Nwaichi is a biochemical researcher in Nigeria, in Ogonilands, who goes out into the Ogonilands and speaks to the illegal refiners who are making fuel from the stuff that they've siphoned off from Shell and other places. It looks coffee-coloured, and she shows them how to make it look a lot more like petrol. And in return, they don't put the waste into the river that pollutes their communities downstream. So, and they don't blow themselves up quite so often. But she's there at gunpoint on her own, a woman, in the middle of the forest, and trying to get them to help her with her research to monitor the rivers. I think it's always good to remind ourselves about what impressive characters there are who are leading our thirst for knowledge as a society. But amongst all this and exciting activity, I know that you, like me, like everyone else, has been thinking about the kind of environment that we now find ourselves in, where some of those intimidatory aspects of being part of the public space have become worse. We all have this language now of disinformation, misinformation. I bet half of you can probably even give definitions of those things. We know far too much about that stuff, and we all know that the engagement that we're looking to transform society with around the research world is not Saturday morning science club. Right? It's not people who are just showing up and tell me, hey, what happens when you put Mentos in a Coke bottle? These are often things that are connected to people's public space, and they are very difficult. I can't tell you how many slideshows. It's a kind of like a researcher pornography of showing, hey, look at these crazy things that people believe. I go to all these slideshows that people put up at events and say, hey, look, here's a quote I found off the internet that shows that people think the earth is flat, and here's a quote I found from an anti-vaxxer who also believes that Michelle Obama's a man. And, but it's almost like this kind of, it's a bit like feasting our eyes on this ignorance as if to sort of thrill ourselves with how frightening the public space is. And I'm rather against it, as you can probably tell. But, we've all got these apocryphal tales. And in truth, we know people who during the pandemic were earnestly trying to help others to navigate their way through really difficult thinking about whether or not to vaccinate children, for example, and had people piling on them from all directions. We saw what happened to some researchers in that environment. We've seen what happens on climate debates when things become incredibly polarized. So there's real need to be thinking about these things. It's not surprising that actually in some work that Elsevier did in 2022, was published in 2022, Researchers in the Spotlight, one of the key things that came out of that was concern that researchers are feeling they should engage in public discussions, feeling the pressure to make sure that research and evidence is showing its worth in the public space, whether that's policy or the wider public, or even areas of practice. But feeling that there isn't a common understanding of the practices and principles of research that they can draw from. That when you say something like uncertainty as a researcher, or you publish in your journals an estimation of uncertainty, that's not the way that question is pursued in the radio interview that follows. And feeling that you don't have that common language, that common understanding. And I should say that we are actually working with Elsevier on taking this forward to produce something which will pull together our best understanding, our best insights around how to do those kinds of things well. So we'll come on to that. So, it's not surprising that researchers feel intimidated. But I felt today I wanted to tell you, in the context of having worked with some of the most aggrieved and angry groups of people around, some of the most polarized debates, I feel that I want to push back on that view of public engagement and putting research in the public space and think about what's possible. Because there's a real risk when we think about tackling things like misinformation and disinformation, that we forget, first of all, what we might call the silent majority, which is most people who don't have any real skin in the game, who are reasonably polite to talk to, who are reasonably willing to listen to different perspectives and wonder what light might researchers throw upon the area that they're in. And that is the vast majority of people in our society. They're just not so noisy on Twitter and YouTube as some other people. And I think it's always important to remember that. For example, I did some work some years ago with Vivian Seng, who at the time was at the William T. Grant Foundation, trying to kind of address the fact that in the US there's been a real backlash against evidence-based education because it seemed like it was the basis on which schools were given or local districts were given the basis to hire and fire, and particularly fire at that time. And at the same time, what you'd had is a lot of drive-by research going on where people were going, well, hey, why don't black kids do well in school? Let's go and ask their teachers, let's go and ask their parents, let's go and ask them, and then never return with anything of use to any of those groups about what they might do that's different in the future. And so I was working on this kind of stuff, and what I was amazed by was just how energetic and willing communities were still to try to have to want to put their dilemmas and their problems into research questions, which was very powerful. And I've just got stories upon stories of people, often people with good grounds to be suspicious of authority or to feel aggrieved, actually being pretty damn good-natured when it comes to the research effort. So I'm going to show you in very, very short order, I'm going to show you a few things about what I think are good stories, so just to pick a handful out. And then I'm going to say where I think the action is needed and the challenges are. And that final part of what I'm going to say, I shall emphasise, is me thinking aloud with you, because I know that the people in this room are the best people to think aloud with, and I'm very interested to know how it looks from your side. I'm telling you how it looks from the side of how to help society do stuff better. So, what's possible? This is, next thing I'm going to show you a short video from Evidence Week in Parliament in the UK, which we open with questions from people all over the country, and we field them at politicians, we put them on the spot. In fact, this is virtual from just over a year ago. This year will be in person again, and they'll actually have heads of committees, which are senior parliamentarians, being grilled this year by members of the public about how they're using evidence, how they're using understanding of things like impact and evaluating the policy effects of what they're doing, of how the government's behaving and so on. And it's, I thought it just might give you a bit of a flavour, because it looks at the experience they had. Most of these people have never spoken in public, or certainly not to a politician before in their lives. So let's have just a little look at how they found it as an experience. And this is people who actually probably do share conspiratorial thinking, a lot of them, on their WhatsApp groups.
How does Parliament assess whether government policies are sufficient to meet its net zero commitment?
I'm an emergency medicine doctor.
Geothermal energy is an untapped resource.
And we have written a letter to the Minister on the subject.
Darren James, who's a postman from Salisbury.
What evidence do you have?
Personalised prescribing.
What I can do, since I'm European.
Differences between different people.
Sex differences in the brain.
Information from the House of Commons Library.
Food and fuel poverty.
A stronger evidence-based framework for future interventions.
Because if you feel you've been missed, we're coming back.
1 in 4 women have suffered a miscarriage.
Menopause, period poverty.
Because evidence matters. Thank you very much indeed.
It was brilliant. The whole hour and a half was captivating.
It's not every day you get the chance to ask the chair of the Environment Audit Committee your question.
You're being heard by MPs. They have to take note of what you're saying.
It kind of empowers you.
People are curious about so many different topics.
I was quite surprised about the amount of research that goes on.
It really opened my eyes to how evidence is used by politicians and select committees.
Anything that increases transparency is a valuable exercise. I would definitely do it again.
That moves me every time, actually, because you can see how easily people like that would share or say, oh, there's no point in ever, saying anything in public, or no point in getting involved in discussions and whatever. And then actually, you can see how utterly transformed they are, and they're not people who've got any torch to carry for the people they're talking to. This is the global calculator. It was designed by a Cambridge mathematician. I think it looks like it was designed by a Cambridge mathematician. But this is something that got rolled out globally in lots of different initiatives. There's one in North America, there's one across Europe, there's one in Brazil, looking at how you could make, effectively using sliders, behind this sits probably some of the most complex data sets around, how you could effectively use sliders to be in the same conversation about how we meet net zero targets. So effectively, some people will say we should all have a South Asian diet, and they'll move the slider for the agricultural effects. Shell will say, yeah, we can all carry on, driving the vehicles and so on, and the way that we'll meet those changes is by changing some other metric. But we can all be in the same conversation. Effectively, Shell and Greenpeace can be in this conversation, as can any member of the public who hates solar panels or whatever. And we can all just talk about, well, okay, the implications of having this or not having wind and solar is that we then need this, nuclear, and so we can have those conversations about the trade-offs to be made. And it takes people in sort of shopping centres around the world approximately 20 minutes to fully get the hang of this, and usually to muscle the researchers out of the way so that they can start playing around with the sliders. And I just think that's a good reminder that sometimes even areas that we think are way too complicated to interest people, there are many opportunities to create an interface with research that people respond well to. This is talking about complicated. I've picked out another UK example, actually, which is this is infant heart surgery outcomes. 20 or 30 years ago in the UK, there was a massive standoff when researchers were found to have been retaining organs in one hospital without the patient's permission. And another hospital, Bristol, was found to have been covering up really poor performance in children's heart surgery. This led to, as you can imagine, to a huge animosity between the patient groups and doctors and the government. And the result of that was that government did a data dump by saying, well, there you go, there's the outcomes of all of the surgical units. And therefore, people dragged very sick children all around the country in search of this elusive great surgical outcome, when in fact they may well have been going to a unit that took easy cases to start with, and it wasn't particularly reliable. This is very difficult. How do you show people things like predicted range and so on? And what we did is we got those parents in at the start of a process to try to, with mathematicians and others involved in rewriting that formula for looking at outcomes. And they came in at the start of it and ended up taking it over effectively and creating the website that explains how to engage with the research and the data on this subject. So much so that when finally it launched a year later, they led the launch of it as well and fronted it all. This was just from feeling involved and being able to put things in their questions and their language. So I think there's no subject, in my experience, and more than 20 years at some of the sharpest parts of science and society, with talking about everything from GMOs to vaccines, there's no subject that has proven itself too complicated or too emotional and controversial for people not to end up in a more productive discussion. So I think there's a lot still to play for, is what I'm saying. A heck of a lot still to play for. And it concerns me greatly that the discussion about how to equip the public and our decision makers and everybody else with a good understanding of research and access to research and the ability to use research in all sorts of ways, that we start always from this point of view of hostility and misinformation and that kind of framework. We perhaps need to think more broadly. So what's needed? Okay, not more lay summaries. It's I applaud the effort. Speaking in human is a great thing. I don't know why. Why do we teach people to write in that bonkers language where you disembody every sentence? I have no idea. But anyway, just speaking in normal language, speaking plainly is great. But we don't need more lay summaries. And that's, I think, a discussion I've had with Taylor and Francis, who I know sort of opened up that field and then started to think about what more is needed. I think what we need is to think about the questions as they appear in society and the relationship between research and those. And that may be, intellectual interest and curiosity, or it might be right at the sharp end, or like, why haven't stem cells solved multiple sclerosis yet, for example. But I think we need to think about the context in which we put research, the social context. Researchers write really well about the research that has been done so far in the field and what they expect their question to add to that stock of knowledge. They don't write very much about that broader social discussion. I found that particularly, I was involved with the Lancet and the Stem Cell Commission of the Lancet, where we just looked at how many announcements there had been of huge breakthroughs, and then no one circled back to explain what had happened to that breakthrough when they came along with the next breakthrough. I think it's really good to put things in context for sure, anticipate the questions, but no, not more lay summaries. I'm telling you now, it would be rather a waste of time. Definitely no more censorship or filters for science and truth. I understand why people want Facebook to start sorting out the fact from the fiction. I think it's a really dangerous place to go. For one thing, it presents the research community as part of some sort of conspiratorial group of people who want to keep the knowledge away from everyone else. And I can't tell you, it plays out very badly, particularly in communities that feel naturally hostile to authority. In fact, it's used as evidence of the fact that they don't get the science and the truth. But also, it's just damn wrong. I mean, if you ever want to explain to people what science is, it's not that. The data, that everything that works with algorithmic technology is working on the past. It's defining things based on what was science yesterday, not what science is going to be tomorrow. right? It's not what knowledge will be tomorrow. So asking a question about lab leaks, for example, one day is okay, then the next day is not okay. We cannot have an environment in which we discuss research that's dominated by those kinds of algorithms. So it is not censorship of any sort or filters for science and truth. It's as soon as we concede that one party owns that, then any party can own that, and it's not necessarily one we like. And no more trusted sources. You're going to be really surprised I say that, I think. I don't mean that you shouldn't be trusted sources. I think many of you are already trusted sources. But announcing trusted sources never works like that. I think thinking about how to be trustworthy is a really important thing to do. But I've seen many hearings now, particularly here and in the UK. We've had various parliamentary inquiries looking at how to promote trusted sources, how to rebrand our national academies as the trusted sources. I can tell you the places where you want people to start going to better sources are never going to buy that. And it isn't really a very useful way to spend time. So, and I think it also just sort of shows really what we need to do is give people the basis on which they themselves can define their own question, can seek their answers, and have maybe hand-holding in that process, a bit of expert input, yeah. But the idea that you take it away from them and write a blank check to somebody else as your source, I don't think that's ever going to sell well, and it certainly hasn't in any environment that I've been working in, from data to GMOs. Okay. What we do need is public guides, and I think this goes to something when Elaine said this morning, my soul leapt this morning when you said that libraries are a pillar of democracy, a pillar of democratic society. I think we have hugely underestimated people who work for the public good, people and institutions, concepts, who work for the public good in our society, and that we as a society don't know they do that. We don't know they exist. I mean, most members of the public do not think of the existence of publishers. They actually barely think of the existence of librarians, and they think about librarians a whole lot more than they think about most other people. They certainly don't think about concepts like the value of having specialist researchers and specialist journalists, the people who are involved early on in the research process, such as research integrity specialists and so on. People don't understand just how much goes on to try to curate knowledge. And I think thinking about those people in our society and how they figure in that landscape is incredibly important. It's a conversation that my organisation started to have with SAGE, actually, to think about a counterpoint here to censorship, is thinking about places where we can encourage people to not go as a trusted source, but to think about who's on their side if they want to ask even a very challenging question. Context and confidence resources. There have been now so many experiences, not just ours at Sense About Science. There are many organisations all over the world that we work with who have helped to, for example, you know, I'm sure many of you, vaccine hesitancy. There are lots of organisations who are working with vaccine hesitant communities to think about the questions that they had and how they could pursue them. Lots of insight, and very little of that's really been pulled together. I think publishers themselves had a lot of insight during the pandemic from trying to respond quickly to questions and what worked and what didn't. I mean, there were times when you saw new studies in the mouths of politicians and just winced at the way that they were being presented. And there were other times when it worked incredibly well, when research synthesis just took off a whole lot. So I think there's a lot to learn. And we'll be working with Elsevier and others over coming years to, months and years, to distill those and to put them, to basically create the kind of tried and tested arguments and effective ways of doing things. I'll give you an example, actually, uncertainty, which I mentioned earlier. One of the things we find we have to say at Sense About Science a lot, particularly when we're dealing with media, is the fact that we're uncertain doesn't mean we know nothing. It doesn't mean that anything could be true, just because we don't know the actual answer to what causes cancer in this particular case doesn't mean that anything can cause cancer. That confidence in new evidence often compares favourably with what we used to know, and that operational knowledge is often enough. You know, it may be the case that Newton's physics wasn't the whole picture, but it was enough to get a man on the moon with a pencil and a ruler, basically. There's sometimes when we have enough knowledge to do a very big thing. And so we need to explain these sorts of things. So these are sorts of insights we have from having discussions and finding out what people find is useful. Similarly, settled and unsettled science is something that people, we don't talk about settled science particularly, but understanding that these things, not all science is the same, is incredibly important. So putting together some resources that actually share some of that insight and that knowledge so that it's not parcelled up at the moment as it is among people who are working in climate, people who are working in vaccines, people who are working in homelessness, people working in education, all learning how to have conversations that are useful and beneficial with different parts of different communities and not synthesising that. And finally, final two things, and then I will end, is evidence user access to new tools to use the research base. One thing I particularly want to flag here is findability. I don't know how much, I'd be really interested to hear from you how much you're thinking about findability in the context where most people's interaction with the research base is going to continue to be through increasingly sophisticated search tools. They do not search on the question of the title of the paper. So it's really important we have a think about actually findability from that point of view, as I know many of you are actually thinking about it from the point of view of AI optimization. Can we think, please, about social optimization and policy optimization as well? And there's a whole lot more to be said in that area. I think making that a live conversation, I would love to see that actually turned into a piece of work in your sector, because I don't think that is something that's thought about, or certainly from my side doesn't look like it's thought about anywhere near enough, and I look to be corrected about that. And then finally, support for researchers in contentious areas. I think incredibly important that researchers have the message that everyone in the information space is prepared to stand up for them, asking difficult questions, even when the environment is quite hostile. The thing that I would say would be incredibly useful here is to start talking much more in terms of what is research and why do we need it, and particularly why do we need it in certain fields. So we do need to have research into the effect of puberty blockers on young children's bodies. We clearly need to have research in that way. The number of people in publishing and research and medical facilities who step back from saying that, even though they know that to be true, and they would always say in any intervention, particularly in children, and particularly in children involving hormones, because we're talking about them in a development stage in their lives, we would definitely need research. Why on earth would you step back from saying we need research and learning how to have that conversation, even in a context of it being difficult? I think we need to look at being able to describe what is research and why do we need it in every situation. Actually, I'm going to end there. Thank you.